Chapter 5 is the first chapter on this new section on decision and decision making. Specifically, Chapter 5 is about improving the quality and speed of decision making. So in terms of decision making and decision sciences, I wanted to cover this in a little bit more depth than the book covers. But the first that I wanted to mention, is also mentioned in the book, is that there are endless decision making models that exist that are out there. Many of them are actually very good and very effective when they're put in the right setting. But there are so many, it's hard to separate them into which ones should I be using when and now. But in terms of general decision sciences, you can boil this down into at least three critical parts of any decision-making process. The first is, what do you want and where do you want to be? And this is why the first section of this book is so important, about establishing that competitive advantage and establishing those goals and getting the right people on board that are aligned with what your organization is trying to accomplish. You've established what you want and where you want to be. And the example from the book, and it's a famous example, is Cheshire Cat from Alice in Wonderland, where Alice is discussing with a cat where she should go. So there's different paths in front of her, and she doesn't know which one to take. And so the cat asks her, "Where do you want to go?" And she replies that she doesn't know. So the Cheshire Cat points out, well, then it really doesn't matter which path you take. It's a famous example to explain that concept. The second aspect is, what do you know? What information do you have? If you don't have any information, flip a coin. If you have two options, or roll a die if there are six options. But if you don't really have valid information or meaningful information to actually affect the outcome, then it doesn't matter. And last is, what do you control? What can you actually change within your decision process? How much does your decision actually move the needle? So these are three critical parts of any decision-making model. Those will be embedded within it. Another important piece from decision sciences is understanding decisions versus outcomes, which I've briefly mentioned before. But with decisions versus outcomes, it's recognizing that just because there's a good result doesn't necessarily mean it was a great decision. There are a lot of factors outside of your control, and there's also a lot of luck involved. And so simply stating, oh, we had a good outcome, therefore our decision was perfect, is a trap that's easy to fall into, especially when you're responsible for the good things. However, when things go poorly, it's easy to say, oh, it was luck. It wasn't because of our decision. So it's recognizing this bias. And, one easy example is, if you are trying to save up your money for retirement and you take that money and you buy lots of lottery tickets with it and you happen to win, was that a good decision? Or was it a bad decision? And was it a good outcome versus a bad outcome? Well, arguably it was a bad decision with a good outcome for this individual involved. Another example that I've seen is those in the leverage buyout industry who, when just talking to them between 1985 and 2005, let's say, is that things went really, really well in the industry right before the crash. And it was like, well, things are going great, so therefore we must be making awesome decisions. It's like, well, they could be good decisions, or they could just be good outcomes with mediocre decisions or even bad decisions. And the final one, which is similar, I heard this a lot more, especially when I was younger, or saw it a lot more, is within the dot-com era, when you had companies that were created and then sold off before the dot-com bust. And these companies, they either didn't really create customer value or they didn't really capture that value. And so the value of that company really wasn't there, but they sold it to other companies before the time of reckoning had arrived. And people point to those examples and say, wow, they sold that company to XYZ other company for $1 billion, so they're brilliant and they made great decisions. It's like, well, maybe it was a good decision on the timing, perhaps, or maybe it was just lucky. I mean, fundamentally, if the underlying value is not there, were those great decisions or great companies to begin with? So now the obligatory slide on how things are generally going, and that is poorly. Poor decisions is the norm. Very few employees feel that their companies or their organizations are good at the decision-making process. And when organizations decide to follow the steps to create better decisions, they see a dramatic improvement in outcomes, which means there's a lot of room to develop and a lot of room to grow, and probably means poor decision making is the norm. The last thing is that obviously decisions are very important, but it's not just the decisions themselves, like one-off decisions, but it's poor structures to make those decisions. It's those coupled together. And of course, these frequently sink organizations. And some of the examples from leading organizations that they used was when decisions on acquisition targets, they just go around in circles, people can't decide, and then competitors end up gobbling up these targets that they wanted to buy that may have been great for the organization. Or when senior leaders make calls about frontline level issues, and they don't really know all the facts, they've never really been on the front line. I'm sure you've probably seen something like this in your career. And this is a great segue back to talent retention, because decision-making effectiveness and involvement are key drivers of employee retention. And if you stop and think about it for a moment, what types of employees do you think really care about decision-making effectiveness and involvement? Is it going to be low performers or high performers? Well, it's going to tend to be your high-performing employees, which makes decision-making effectiveness all the more important, because if your high-performing employees aren't happy with the organization, decide to leave to go elsewhere because of the decision-making process, its level of effectiveness and their involvement in it, then you're driving out your high performers and retaining your low performers. Also, decision-making effectiveness and involvement is higher on the list of priorities for employees than most people think. I mean, it ranks higher frequently than challenging work or career advancement opportunities and other items that people frequently recognize as, oh, we need to have this in order to retain our top talent. But frequently they don't think of, well, what's the level of effectiveness of decision making in the organization, and what is the employee's level of involvement in the decisions that they should be involved in. Let's discuss actually improving the decision process. Now, the easiest way to kick off to improve the decision-making process is to differentiate between the different types of decisions and to start avoiding the law of triviality, which is so easy to fall into. Now, the law of triviality is simply that trivial items consume more and more time, partially because everyone has an opinion about trivial items. And so we need to get past the trivial items, look at the items that actually matter, and differentiate between them. And to get past those trivial items, one approach that I like, it's actually originated from my brother, which is the concept of strategic neglect, that I'm purposefully choosing areas to ignore because there are other areas that are more important to focus on. Of course, that should be applied judiciously, but I really like that term. Now, breaking down the different types of decisions, so a type A decision would be a decision that's very important, but it's infrequent. Think about acquiring another company. Very important decision, doesn't happen all that often. It needs to have all the right people involved. You need to have the right data. You can have a process of what are called stage gates, where you're breaking up the process into chunks and making sure that each step of the process is done correctly. You're cognizant of the biases that you have. So a type A decision, very important, doesn't happen all that often. And so you can't afford to we'll try it out a few times and we'll take a prototype or a pilot. That doesn't quite work for type A decisions. Then you get to type B decisions. These are high frequency but lower importance. Now, this is an area that's actually great for developing your high potential talent. You can delegate responsibilities to them with a high standard of accountability and transparency, so that you understand what's going on, with also that risk thresholds are tied into it. So if anything pops up that starts to bump up in importance, others with perhaps more experience will be able to step in and assist the person who's accountable in order to make better decisions. There's also type C decisions, which are high importance and high frequency. This is frequently the bread and butter of your organization. Think of a product design for a company. You need to get that product design right, but you do product designs fairly frequently, fairly often. This isn't a rare occurrence. This is something that you do on a frequent basis, but it's very, very important because this is what your company's riding on. This is what its success is. This is where you find competitive advantage. And so here you have formal processes, you have clear roles. You also have shared language so that everyone is on the same page and everyone has the right vision and mind of what good looks like, of what success looks like. And accompanying this, you have feedback loops so that learning can develop and it can occur. And it can occur iteratively so every product design can get better and better and better. I love this next section of the book on dialogue and data because it's this major issue that you see everywhere. But if you don't point it out explicitly, people can go their entire careers without realizing that it's there. This concept of dialogue and data coupled together. Now, if you look at within your organization, you could say, well, everyone makes decisions based on data. I mean, how many times have you walked into a meeting of something of any importance whatsoever, and you ask them, well, what is this decision based off of? And they say, well, just my gut, it says so. No, they're going to have data, they're going to have charts to support it. But as we've already discussed, we're continually making bad decisions. So it's not just data alone that seems to be the issue. It's the dialogue surrounding it. These bad decisions are still ubiquitous. And so take a step back and think about your data. Well, what data makes it through the filters? Sometimes critical data doesn't trickle up to the level that it should. It creates, the geeks versus jocks divide, where the geeks might know what's going on, but it doesn't actually make it to the decision makers. There are also other items out there that are non-numeric that need a voice. It's data that we haven't captured in terms of ones and zeros in data, but that information is critically important to this decision, but that information isn't making it to the table. Or another way is you look at the data, and I've sat down in the decision-making committee, I've looked at the data, and I've thought, man, this data clearly points in one direction, but others at the table looked at the same data and came to the exact opposite conclusion that I did. So there's this narrative surrounding the data, so just the data itself isn't sufficient to say, well, this is going to deliver my results. We have the data. You have to have the right narrative around it. So how can you create this narrative? Well, it's making sure that you have the right people involved at each one of the stages. One of the suggestions from leading organizations was using the RACI model, having the right people who in the right roles, and they know what their roles are, who is responsible, who's accountable, who is consulted, and who is informed of the decision after the fact. This is one method to make sure that the dialogue and data go together in a way that creates the right decision process. Now, even if you get the dialogue and the data right, there's still going to be biases. And the reason for this is because we're all biased. I'm biased, you are biased. Even if we recognize that we're biased, that still doesn't fix the fact that we are biased. So we're going to walk through just a few of those and what we can do about it. So first is confirmation bias. I'm sure you've seen this before, something to the effect of, I'm sure this decision is going to be fantastic. Now go do an analysis to tell me how fantastic it's going to be. One way to deal with confirmation bias is pre-mortem. A pre-mortem analysis is basically the opposite of confirmation bias. You go into it assuming that everything's going to go horribly wrong, and you're trying to figure out why this is going to go horribly wrong. And that's your analysis. It's the exact opposite of confirmation bias. And it's a good way to deal with confirmation bias and reveal some blind spots. Second is optimism. And I'm sure you've been in situations or you've heard of them where someone's created a base case scenario, and that base case scenario seems really optimistic. This isn't the optimistic scenario, it's the base case. See, and it's something that we all suffer from. How many times have you said you're going to be 10 minutes late and instead you're 15, 20, 30 minutes? Why are we systematically optimistic? Well, it's because we're humans. Well, how can we deal with this? One of my favorite ways to deal with this is actually generalized applications. And here's a quick story from the decision sciences sphere. So you take someone who's very familiar with a specific country who works in government intelligence. And you ask this person, okay, this specific country, what's the chance that this dictator or this country, collapses that's ruled by this dictator within the next 12 months? And they'll say maybe 30% because they are specialists on that country. Now you take other people who don't know quite as much. And so what do? They go look at other situations, say other countries in a similar situation. And they say, well, in the past, with similar situations, well, what's the chance of that country collapsing under that dictator? So, well, normally it's about 10 or 12%. So I don't really know much about this, but things seem a little bit worse than the average. So maybe I'll say 15. Now, that person with less specific information is frequently right more often, or has a better sense or a better probabilistic application of a prediction of the future, simply because they're able to generalize better. And that's something that can deal with optimism. Well, we've done this 10 times before, or similar things before. Let's look at those scenarios, and those can be our base case. Now, the last of these common biases are social biases. Things like groupthink, where one person or one leader says what they think, and we all nod our heads and say, that is a great idea. I once worked with a vice president who was really good at dealing with social biases by basically cold calling on people and saying, what's the critical problem with choosing this route? Do you know what it is? As if he was putting on the spot, and it was like a quiz, like they should already know. And then they would answer and come up with something. Frequently, they'd come up with really, really good items that we didn't consider. Another way of dealing with this is reverse seniority, and to deal with, say, the geeks versus jocks divide, the people who know what's going on versus those who are making decisions, is you solicit input from the people with the most knowledge but the least amount of general power to actually influence the decision, and you get their input first, and you work your way up the chain. Now, even if that doesn't change your decision, those who are a little bit closer to what's going on will frequently point out risks that need to be mitigated and dealt with, so that it actually dramatically improves the decision, even if the general decision's the same. So to wrap up, remember the fundamentals of decision sciences. First, what do you want? Where do you want to be? Second, what do you know? And third, what can you control, or what decisions can be made? Second, realize you have a lot of room to improve, and as you improve, you'll be improving on the other metric from the first section of this book on retaining your best employees. Remember the importance and frequency framework. Practice a little strategic neglect. Identify type A, B, and C decisions, and create the right process around those A, B, C decisions. Remember, it's dialogue and data. Everybody's using data, and they're still making bad decisions frequently. You have to get the dialogue and data right. And last, reduce the impact of your biases. This is especially important for type A decisions. We all have them. We need to deal with them. Being aware isn't enough.